Before the 19th century, many maps of Europe and Asia shared a name that today has almost completely faded from public memory. That name was Tartaria. It did not refer to a single city or a minor kingdom, but to a vast region spanning Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and large parts of Siberia. For centuries, Tartaria appeared consistently in Western atlases and geographic records, treated as a real and significant part of the known world. Then, in the early 1800s, something changed. After the year 1816, the name Tartaria began to appear less frequently in maps, textbooks, and official histories, as cartographic conventions evolved and administrative borders became more precise. There was no widely recorded war that erased it, no clear treaty that dissolved it, and no single documented event explaining why such a broad geographic label gradually fell out of use. At the exact same time, the world experienced one of the most severe climate disruptions ever documented. The year 1816 became known as the year without a summer. Snow fell across parts of North America in June. The frost destroyed crops in the middle of summer. Harvests failed across Europe, food prices soared, and famine spread through entire regions. Millions of people were affected, not just by hunger, but by the social chaos that followed. What makes this period especially unusual is what came next. The aftermath of 1816 was not limited to a brief recovery period. Instead, in many regions it coincided with mass population movements, the expansion of institutions, and significant changes in social organization. Communities were relocated, children were placed through organized programs, and new systems emerged to manage displaced and vulnerable populations. History offers a well-documented explanation for the climate disruption itself. A volcanic eruption. In 1815, Mount Tambora erupted in Indonesia, cooling the planet and disrupting global weather patterns. But if this was only a temporary climate event, why did many of its social and institutional consequences persist for decades? And why did the decline of broad geographic terms like Tartaria occur during the same period of global restructuring? What if 1816 was not just a year without summer, but a turning point in which environmental stress accelerated changes that were already reshaping the world? In this episode, we explore how the year without a summer reshaped societies, how population movement and new institutions emerged across continents, and how shifts in mapping and administration reflected a broader transformation taking place at the same time. If a thought or a question stays with you, you may share it softly in the comments below. And if you wish to drift further into mysteries like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and stay with the channel. The stories that follow will be here whenever you return. By early 1816, weather conditions across the northern hemisphere began to diverge sharply from seasonal expectations. What initially appeared as localized irregularities soon developed into a broader pattern affecting North America, Europe, and parts of Asia at the same time. These changes were gradual in onset but severe in impact, becoming increasingly difficult for contemporaries to ignore as the year progressed. In New England, temperatures dropped unexpectedly during late spring and early summer. Snowfall was recorded in June, followed by repeated frosts in July and August. These conditions damaged crops at critical stages of growth, leaving farmers with little opportunity to recover before the end of the growing season. Similar reports emerged from eastern Canada, where rivers that normally thawed in spring froze again during the summer months, disrupting transport routes and local commerce. Across the Atlantic, European regions experienced comparable disruptions. In Switzerland and northern France, frost events were documented well into the summer, destroying vineyards, grain fields, and pastureland. Agricultural output declined sharply, not because of isolated storms, but due to sustained temperature instability that made normal planting and harvesting cycles difficult to maintain. The economic consequences of these failures became visible by mid-year. In England, grain shortages pushed the price of wheat to more than 3 times its previous level within a single year. Bread, a staple food for much of the population, became increasingly unaffordable. Similar price increases were recorded in parts of Germany, where shortages contributed to food riots as communities competed for limited supplies. In Ireland, dependence on vulnerable crops amplified the effects of failed harvests, intensifying hardship across rural areas. These developments were extensively documented at the time. Farmers recorded crop losses in personal journals. Merchants tracked price fluctuations in account books. Local authorities submitted reports detailing shortages, relief efforts, and growing unrest. Church records and municipal archives noted increases in poverty, displacement, and mortality. The consistency of these records across different regions suggests that the events of 1816 were not isolated anomalies, but part of a widespread and sustained environmental disruption. By the end of the year, it was evident that 1816 differed significantly from previous periods of unfavorable weather. The scale of crop failure, the geographic reach of the cold, and the social consequences that followed placed extraordinary strain on existing systems of food production and distribution. While temperatures would eventually moderate, the immediate effects of the year without a summer had already set longer-term processes in motion. In the years that followed, researchers and historians sought to identify the cause of the climate disruptions observed in 1816. The explanation that emerged centered on the eruption of Mount Tambora, located in present-day Indonesia, which occurred in April 1815. Contemporary accounts described the eruption as catastrophic, and modern scientific analysis has since confirmed its exceptional scale. Tambora expelled vast quantities of volcanic ash, sulfur dioxide, and other particulates high into the atmosphere. According to climate models, these materials formed aerosols that reflected incoming solar radiation, reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. This process, known as volcanic cooling, is capable of lowering global temperatures for a limited period following major eruptions. The timing of Tambora's eruption aligns closely with the onset of the abnormal weather patterns recorded in 1816. As a result, the volcanic explanation has become the standard interpretation presented in academic literature and educational materials, offering a clear causal mechanism linking a specific natural event to the observed climatic effects. In many respects, this explanation is well supported. Volcanic activity has been shown to influence climate in the past, and Tambora's magnitude makes it a plausible driver of widespread cooling. The theory accounts for reduced temperatures, shortened growing seasons, and the immediate agricultural impacts documented across multiple continents. However, the widespread acceptance of this explanation has sometimes led to the treatment of 1816 as a closed case. Once the climatic trigger is identified, less attention is paid to the broader consequences that unfolded afterward. Yet historical analysis requires more than identifying initial causes. It also requires examining the duration and nature of societal responses. Volcanic winters are generally short-lived phenomena, with climatic effects that typically diminish within a few years as atmospheric conditions stabilize. In contrast, many of the disruptions associated with 1816 extended well beyond the period of cooling. Population displacement increased over subsequent decades, systems for managing poverty and migration expanded rather than contracted, and infrastructure built during this period suggests planning for long-term conditions rather than temporary relief. This discrepancy raises important considerations. If the primary cause was a brief environmental disturbance, why did many responses take on permanent characteristics? Why did similar institutional solutions appear across different countries, despite limited means of coordination? And why did the social consequences of 1816 continue to shape the 19th century long after temperatures returned to more typical levels? These questions do not negate the role of Mount Tambora. Instead, they highlight the need to examine whether the volcanic explanation fully accounts for what followed. Understanding 1816 requires not only acknowledging what triggered the crisis, but also analyzing how profoundly it altered the structures that came after it. When historians and scientists look back at 1816, they often focus on how cold it was. But temperature alone doesn't tell the full story. What stands out in the records is not just that the world cooled, but how uneven that cooling appeared to be across different regions. Some areas were affected quickly and severely, with crops failing almost immediately and entire growing seasons collapsing, leaving communities little time to adapt. Yet other regions, sometimes at similar latitudes, experienced milder effects or saw disruption arrive later. The cooling did not unfold evenly or smoothly. Instead, it appeared in clusters with sharp contrasts from place to place. Timing adds another layer of complexity. In several local records, unusual weather patterns are noted earlier than expected, before a single global mechanism would normally be assumed to have fully taken effect. Individually, these anomalies are not dramatic, but taken together, they complicate the idea of a simple, uniform climate event progressing in a predictable way. What becomes most significant is what followed. As temperatures gradually stabilized, the crisis did not resolve. Food shortages persisted, economic pressure increased, and emergency responses did not scale back. Instead, many of them expanded. Measures introduced as temporary responses evolved into lasting systems, and short-term disruption gave way to longer-term instability. Climate disturbances typically fade as conditions normalize, but in the case of 1816, the cold receded while many of the consequences remained. Whatever began in that year set changes in motion that continued shaping societies well after weather patterns returned closer to their previous norms. After 1816, the world did not simply cool and recover. It began to shift. Across Europe, rural communities weakened by repeated crop failures struggled to sustain themselves. Families left the countryside and moved into cities that were already under strain. Urban populations grew rapidly, often without the infrastructure needed to support them, creating new concentrations of poverty and dependence rather than stability. Further east, population centers changed as well. Some regions gradually emptied, while others absorbed people at rates difficult to explain by ordinary demographic growth alone. These movements were not brief or seasonal. They reflected long-term relocation, driven by the sense that returning home was no longer viable. In parts of Asia, population records from the early 19th century show abrupt changes and gaps that suggest disruption rather than gradual transition. These shifts indicate movement driven less by opportunity than by the breakdown of existing systems. A key feature across regions is duration. These movements did not peak and then stop. They continued year after year, with communities reorganizing around the expectation that instability was not temporary. The United States followed a similar pattern, though on a larger scale. As eastern cities became more crowded and strained, westward expansion accelerated. Relocation increasingly became a way of managing pressure, poverty, and displacement. Movement shifted from being an exception to becoming a structural response. It is within this context that one of the more unusual systems of the 19th century took shape. Beginning in 1853, a new program emerged in the United States. Children were taken from crowded eastern cities, placed on trains, and sent west to be placed with rural families. Over time, more than 200,000 children were relocated through this system. Known as the orphan trains, the program was not a short-term reaction to a single crisis. It operated for nearly 80 years, involving coordination among charities, churches, and local authorities, with established routes and procedures. This level of organization reflects a system designed for continuity rather than emergency improvisation. Many of the children were not orphans in the strict sense. Some had living parents. Others came from families no longer able to support them. Once relocated, children were often given new names, and original records were frequently lost or set aside. For many, their documented history effectively begins with the train journey itself. If the hardship following 1816 had been brief, such a system would be difficult to explain. Short-term famine relief does not typically require decades of organized child relocation. But if instability had become persistent, then managing future populations would have taken on greater importance. Children were easier to relocate than adults, easier to place, and easier to integrate into new communities. The orphan trains did more than move individuals. They redistributed the next generation. By the time the program ended in 1929, it had quietly altered the demographic and social fabric of the country. It stands as a clear indication that the world after 1816 was not merely recovering from a bad year, but adapting to conditions that had fundamentally changed. In the decades following 1816, something else began to change quietly but dramatically. Across multiple continents, a wave of construction appeared that differed from ordinary rebuilding after hardship. These were not small projects meant to address short-term needs. They were large, permanent structures, built for similar functions, and often following comparable design principles, emerging within the same general period in different parts of the world. In Britain, the workhouse system expanded rapidly after 1820. These were not simple shelters. They were large institutions designed to house and administer significant numbers of people under centralized oversight. Across Europe, asylums and reformatories followed a similar pattern. They appeared in clusters, often supported by the state, and were constructed to operate on a long-term basis. In the United States, orphanages and almshouses were built on an unusually large scale, even in towns where immediate demand was not always obvious. These buildings were not improvised. They were planned, engineered, and standardized, suggesting that they reflected broader policy approaches rather than isolated responses to local hardship. What these structures share is notable. Many were built with deep foundations and thick walls, more substantial than typical residential buildings of the time. Their layouts were symmetrical and highly organized, designed to separate functions and manage large groups of occupants. Heating and ventilation systems were often advanced for their era, indicating an expectation of continuous use rather than temporary relief. Capacity provides another point of interest. In many cases, these institutions were designed to accommodate far more people than local conditions alone might have required. This scale is difficult to explain if the goal was merely to respond to a brief crisis such as a poor harvest or short famine. It aligns more closely with expectations of sustained displacement and ongoing administrative responsibility. These buildings did not disappear once conditions improved. They became lasting features of the social landscape, operating for decades and, in some cases, more than a century. Their continued use suggests that the challenges they were built to address were not expected to resolve quickly. Taken together, this architectural trend resembles infrastructure rather than emergency aid. It reflects a shift in how societies approached human vulnerability, moving away from informal, community-based responses towards centralized institutional systems designed for long-term operation. Architecture can reveal priorities that are not always explicitly stated in written records. In this case, the scale and durability of these buildings suggest preparation for conditions in which traditional social structures were under increasing strain. Whatever pressures emerged in the early 19th century required not only relief, but sustained organization. While institutions were expanding across Europe and America, something else was gradually disappearing. On maps produced before the 19th century, the name Tartaria appears repeatedly, spanning a vast region from Eastern Europe across Central Asia and into Siberia. It was not marked as a small state or minor territory, but as a broad geographic region recognized by mapmakers of the time. Within a few decades after 1816, that name began to fade from maps. New editions no longer labeled Tartaria as a single region. Instead, the area was divided, renamed, or incorporated into other administrative frameworks. This shift did not coincide with a widely recorded global war, a single decisive conquest, or a formal treaty marking the end of Tartaria as a political entity. What followed was not a clear explanatory narrative, but a gradual absence. There is little direct documentation explaining how such a large named region fell out of use in global cartography. The change appears gradual on paper, yet relatively abrupt in historical terms. One generation commonly encounters the name. The next largely does not. This disappearance becomes more notable when viewed alongside the broader disruptions of the early 19th century. When regions become difficult to govern, inhabit, or integrate into existing systems, administrative reorganization often follows. Boundaries shift, names change, and mapping conventions are updated accordingly. Maps are not neutral documents. They reflect political decisions, administrative priorities, and practical considerations. When a name disappears from maps across multiple countries, it usually signals a change in how that space is managed or understood. In the case of Tartaria, the lack of a single defining event leaves open questions about what conditions made such a transition necessary. The timing is significant. Tartaria's fading from maps occurs during the same period when societies elsewhere were expanding institutions to manage displaced populations and adjusting settlement patterns. While this does not demonstrate a direct connection, it places the change within a wider context of global restructuring. Rather than a dramatic collapse recorded through wars or treaties, Tartaria's presence appears to dissolve quietly through administrative change. In some cases, historical transitions are recorded not through decisive events, but through omission, renaming, and gradual reclassification. By the mid-19th century, Tartaria was no longer a term widely recognized by the public, yet the conditions surrounding its disappearance align with a world undergoing rapid adjustment after profound disruption. Whether Tartaria functioned primarily as a political entity, a cultural region, or a geographic convention, its removal from maps remains one of the more curious transformations of the period. When considered alongside the rise of large-scale institutions and long-term population management, that transformation becomes difficult to view in isolation. In modern climate science, nuclear winter is not a historical claim. It is a theoretical model, a framework used to understand what happens when the atmosphere is suddenly filled with large amounts of particulate matter. What defines this model is not the cause itself, but the pattern of effects it produces. One defining feature is speed. Temperatures drop rapidly, not over centuries, but within months. Another is uneven impact. Cooling does not affect the planet uniformly. Some regions experience severe disruption, while others are affected far less. A third feature is regional intensity, where damage concentrates in specific zones, rather than spreading smoothly across the globe. Most importantly, these models emphasize that climate disruption is only the starting point. The more enduring crisis comes afterward. Food systems break down unevenly. Populations are displaced. Authorities shift their focus toward relocation, shelter, and long-term management rather than short-term relief. Recovery in these scenarios is slow, fragmented, and structural. There is no direct evidence that any nuclear event occurred in 1816. No physical proof. No historical record acknowledging such a catastrophe. That distinction is essential. This comparison is not presented as a conclusion or a claim about cause. However, when patterns observed in the early 19th century are compared with this type of model, certain similarities become noticeable. Rapid climate disruption, uneven regional effects, population movement that continues across generations, the expansion of institutions designed to manage people over extended periods, administrative changes that prioritize reorganization rather than simple restoration. Viewed through this lens, the disappearance of large geographic labels from maps, such as Tartaria, appears less puzzling, not as a sudden collapse, but as part of a broader process of restructuring. When regions become difficult to govern or integrate, populations relocate, names change, and administrative records are simplified. This comparison does not assert what happened. It helps clarify the kind of aftermath societies were responding to, and it leads to a final question. If the consequences resemble known models of extreme disruption, does the standard explanation fully account for the scale and duration of what followed? If 1816 were only the result of a volcanic eruption, one might expect the world's response to be temporary. Short-term disasters usually produce short-term solutions. Relief efforts eventually wind down. Systems gradually return to familiar patterns. That is not what followed the year without a summer. Instead, many societies adapted in ways that suggest deeper, longer-lasting change. Populations were relocated rather than simply restored. Institutions expanded to manage people over extended periods. Entire regions were reorganized administratively, and names that once appeared consistently on maps, such as Tartaria, gradually fell out of use without a single clear explanatory moment. If 1816 marked not just a brief environmental shock, but a turning point that accelerated the decline of older systems, then the scale of what followed becomes easier to contextualize. Not simply as recovery, but as restructuring. Not necessarily as progress, but as adaptation to altered conditions. Viewed this way, the year without a summer becomes more than a climate anomaly. It functions as a boundary, a dividing line between a world shaped by earlier assumptions and one reorganized under new constraints. History is shaped not only by events themselves, but by how they are recorded, categorized, and remembered. When records thin out, names disappear, and explanations become simpler over time, it is reasonable to ask what complexities may no longer fit neatly within the prevailing narrative.